Picture this. It's a cold night somewhere in Africa, maybe 400,000 years ago. A small group of early humans huddles together in the darkness, watching something that most animals flee from in terror. A flickering orange glow, dancing flames, fire. But they're not running. They're feeding it, carefully placing branches and dry grass to keep it alive. And in that moment, without knowing it, they're doing something that will change the trajectory of life on Earth forever. Today, you're sitting in a climate-controlled room, probably looking at a screen with technology that would seem like magic to people just a century ago. You've got instant access to more information than entire civilizations possessed. You can communicate with someone on the other side of the planet in seconds. You live roughly twice as long as your ancestors did just 10 generations back. And all of it, every single bit of our modern dominance, traces back to that moment when our ancestors decided to do something absolutely insane. They brought fire into their lives and kept it there. Now, you might think fire was just about staying warm or scaring off predators, and sure, that was part of it. But what actually happened was so much more profound, so much more transformative, that it literally rewired our biology. Fire didn't just change what we did, it changed what we are. See, there's this question that's bothered scientists for decades. Why are humans so different from every other animal? We've got these massive brains that consume 20% of our energy, despite being only 2% of our body weight. We live in every environment on Earth, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests. We cooperate in groups of millions of strangers. We create art and music and mathematics. Other primates are smart, sure, but they're not building particle accelerators. They're not writing symphonies. They're not sending robots to Mars. So what happened to us? What made us so radically different? The answer is sitting in front of many of you right now, even if you don't realize it. That candle on your nightstand, the fireplace in your living room, the pilot light in your furnace, fire. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I love checking and seeing Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at lights out, all at once. Anyway, back to fire. What scientists have discovered over the last few decades is that fire didn't just help our ancestors survive. It triggered 3 revolutionary changes that fundamentally transformed what it means to be human. Revolution number 1, cooking. When we started heating our food, we unlocked nutrients that were previously inaccessible. Our guts got smaller. Our brains got bigger. Our teeth changed shape. We're talking about biological evolution driven by technology. Fire literally changed our anatomy. Revolution number 2, conquering the night. For millions of years, darkness meant danger. When the sun went down, our ancestors had to hide and sleep because anything else meant becoming dinner for predators with better night vision. But fire pushed back the darkness. It extended the day. Suddenly, our ancestors had evenings, had time to socialize and plan and create after the work of finding food was done. We essentially doubled our productive hours. Revolution number 3, the social fire. This might be the most important one. When you sit around a fire, something magical happens. You can see faces, you can read expressions, you can tell stories. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, there was a reason and a place for large groups to gather after dark and just talk. That changed everything about how we cooperate, how we share knowledge, how we build culture. These 3 revolutions, cooking, conquering night, and social gathering, didn't just make life easier. They created a feedback loop that built what scientists call the super brain. Our ancestors who controlled fire could extract more calories from food, which powered bigger brains. Bigger brains meant better social skills and planning ability, which meant better use of fire. Better use of fire meant even more calories and even more social time. Round and round, generation after generation, for hundreds of thousands of years. And here's the really wild part. We can trace this in our DNA, in our fossils, in the archaeological record. We can actually watch it happen. We can see the moment when fire transformed our ancestors from just another clever ape into something unprecedented, something that would eventually dominate this entire planet. So let's go back, way back, before fire, before cooking, before evening gatherings and cave paintings and language as we know it. Let's look at what life was actually like for our ancestors and understand just how brutal existence was before that first spark changed everything. Close your eyes and imagine you're hungry. Not modern hungry, where you can raid the fridge or order takeout. We're talking about 2 million years ago hungry. You're standing in the African savanna, the sun beating down, and you need to eat. But here's the problem. Everything you can eat is raw, tough, and packed with fiber that your body can barely process. You spot a tuber. One of your group members digs it up with a stick. It's about the size of your fist, covered in dirt. You brush it off and take a bite. The texture is like chewing through a combination of wood and rubber. Your jaw muscles, which are massive compared to modern humans, start working. Chew, chew, chew. 5 minutes later, you're still chewing the same mouthful. Your jaw's getting tired, but you can't stop because this tuber contains maybe 150 calories, and you need about 2,000 just to survive the day. So you keep chewing, and chewing, and chewing. This was life before fire. This was the harsh, unforgiving reality that shaped human evolution for millions of years. And understanding just how brutal it was makes what comes next seem absolutely miraculous. Let's talk about the digestive burden first, because this is where the pre-fire existence really gets desperate. Modern humans spend maybe 30 minutes to an hour eating each day. We sit down, consume processed cooked food, and move on with our lives. Our ancestors, they spent a minimum of 6 hours daily just eating. Not hunting, not gathering, just the actual mechanical process of chewing and swallowing. Primatologists have studied this extensively in modern great apes, and the numbers are staggering. Gorillas spend about 8 hours a day eating. Chimpanzees, about 6 hours. Orangutans, similar. These animals have enormous jaw muscles, specialized teeth for grinding plant material, and digestive systems that are basically fermentation vats designed to break down cellulose over many hours. Early hominids were facing the same constraints, possibly worse. When you eat raw plant material, you're consuming huge amounts of indigestible fiber. Your gut has to be massive just to hold it all while bacteria slowly break it down. Archaeological evidence from early hominin fossils shows exactly this. Huge rib cages, barrel chests, all the skeletal indicators of enormous digestive systems taking up most of the torso. But here's where it gets really interesting. That massive gut wasn't just uncomfortable. It was expensive, metabolically speaking. Digestive tissue is energetically costly. Your intestines, stomach, liver, all those organs require significant calories just to maintain themselves. In modern humans, the gut accounts for about 20–25% of our resting metabolic rate, despite being only a small percentage of body weight. For early hominids with guts twice the size of ours, this metabolic cost would have been even higher. You're spending enormous energy just to digest food that provides barely enough energy to justify eating it in the first place. It's a trap, an evolutionary dead end that kept our ancestors locked in a cycle of constant foraging and endless chewing. And the calorie problem gets worse when you factor in brain size. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have brains around 400 cubic centimeters. That brain requires about 200 calories per day to function, roughly 8–9% of their total energy budget. It's manageable, barely, on a raw food diet with 6+ hours of daily eating. Early hominids like Australopithecus had similar brain sizes and faced similar constraints. They were smart for their time, capable of using simple tools, living in social groups, but they had hit a metabolic ceiling. You can't power a bigger brain without more calories, and you can't get more calories from raw food without spending even more time eating, which creates a vicious cycle. Some groups tried to solve this through dietary specialization. Paranthropus, Boise, a hominin species that lived around 2 million years ago, developed absolutely massive molars and jaw muscles. Anthropologists call them nutcracker man because their skulls show adaptations for crushing extremely hard foods like nuts and seeds. They were trying to extract more calories from difficult-to-process foods, but this strategy led to an evolutionary dead end. Paranthropus went extinct. They had specialized so heavily for one type of food that when environmental conditions changed, they couldn't adapt. Their massive jaws and specialized teeth made them incredibly efficient at one thing and mediocre at everything else. Meanwhile, other hominin lines were experimenting with different strategies. Some populations started scavenging meat from predator kills, using stone tools to access bone marrow after lions and hyenas had finished with a carcass. Meat provides more calories per gram than plant material, and animal fat is even better, nearly twice the caloric density of protein or carbohydrates. But there was a problem with scavenging, actually several problems. First, you're competing with hyenas, which are incredibly efficient scavengers with bone-crushing jaws. Second, carrion is often partially decomposed, full of bacteria that can kill you if your digestive system isn't adapted to handle it. Third, and most importantly, scavenging opportunities were unpredictable and scattered. You might find a carcass once a week, maybe less, and the rest of the time you're back to eating raw plants for 6 hours a day. Then there was the night problem. Modern humans think of nighttime as peaceful, maybe a little dark, but essentially just another part of the day. For early hominids, night was when the world became actively hostile. Your vision, which is specialized for color perception and detail in daylight, becomes nearly useless after dark. You can see shapes, movement, but not the detail you need to navigate safely or identify threats. Meanwhile, every major predator in Africa has night vision that makes them exponentially more dangerous after sunset. Lions hunt primarily at dusk and dawn. Leopards are active throughout the night. Hyenas, which killed more early hominids than any other predator, are primarily nocturnal, and all of them could see perfectly while you stumbled around half-blind. Archaeological sites from this period show something chilling: hominin fossils with bite marks, skulls punctured by leopard fangs, long bones cracked open by hyena jaws, not for tools, but because hominids themselves were prey. The predator-to-prey ratio in these fossil assemblages suggests early hominids were being killed and eaten regularly. So what did they do? They climbed trees. Fossil evidence and comparative anatomy suggest early hominids retained tree-climbing adaptations specifically for sleeping. They would spend daylight hours foraging on the ground, then retreat to trees at night, huddling together on branches while predators prowled below. It wasn't safe exactly. You could fall. Leopards could climb after you, but it was safer than staying on the ground. This created another constraint on social organization. You can't form large groups if everyone needs to find secure sleeping spots in trees every night. Trees have limited capacity, so early hominin groups were probably small, maybe 10-20 individuals maximum. And even then, they'd need to find groves with multiple suitable trees within close proximity. Daytime wasn't much better in terms of social complexity. When everyone spends 6 hours eating, scattered across a landscape foraging for dispersed plant foods, there's limited time for social interaction. You can't develop sophisticated communication when your day consists of waking up, climbing down from trees, walking to foraging sites, chewing for 6 hours, walking to sleeping sites, climbing trees, and sleeping. Some researchers think this is why early hominin communication remained primitive for millions of years, not because they lacked the cognitive capacity, but because they lacked the time and social context in which complex language would be useful. When you're chewing tubers for 6 hours, you can't talk. When your group is scattered across half a square mile foraging, you can't have extended conversations. The geographical constraints were equally limiting. Early hominids were trapped in relatively narrow ecological zones. They needed year-round access to plant foods, water sources, and some degree of tree cover for nighttime safety. This meant they were restricted primarily to woodland savanna mosaics in East and Southern Africa. Climate records from this period show how limiting this was. Between 2 and 3 million years ago, global climate was becoming increasingly variable. Wet periods alternated with dry periods, sometimes quite abruptly. When conditions were good, hominin populations could expand into marginal habitats. When droughts hit, they contracted back into core refuge areas or went extinct. Genetic diversity studies of modern humans, extrapolated backward, suggest early hominin populations were probably quite small, maybe tens of thousands of individuals maximum, possibly much fewer. They were living on the edge, always a few bad years away from extinction. Now here's where the archaeological mystery comes in, because scientists have been arguing about when fire use actually began for decades, and the evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. The earliest widely accepted evidence of controlled fire use comes from sites in Africa and the Middle East dating to about 400,000 years ago. These sites show burned bones, charred plant remains, and discolored sediments in patterns that suggest intentional fires rather than natural wildfires. But there are tantalizing hints of much earlier fire use. A site in South Africa called Wonderwerk Cave has evidence of burned bone and plant ash dating to 1 million years ago. Another site in Kenya, Chesawanja, has burned clay fragments potentially dating to 1.4 million years ago. And some researchers think they found evidence of fire use at Swartkrans Cave in South Africa, dating back nearly 1.5 million years. The problem is that proving early fire use is extraordinarily difficult. Wildfires happen naturally in Africa. Lightning strikes, volcanic activity, spontaneous combustion of plant material, all these can create burned materials that look similar to what humans would produce. To prove intentional fire use, you need to show repeated burning in the same location, evidence of fire maintenance, burned materials that wouldn't naturally burn together, things that are hard to preserve over millions of years. Some researchers think our ancestors might have been using fire opportunistically, long before they learned to create and maintain it. Imagine a wildfire sweeps through an area. Our ancestors observed that animals killed by the fire are easier to eat, that certain plants become more digestible when burned. They start hanging around recent fire sites, scavenging burned food, maybe even carrying smoldering branches to new locations to create smoke that drives away insects. This opportunistic fire use wouldn't leave much archaeological evidence. No hearths, no fire pits, just occasional interactions with natural fires. But it would have been enough to start the evolutionary process, enough to demonstrate that fire could make food more digestible and life more comfortable. What we do know is that something changed. Somewhere between 2 million and 400,000 years ago, some population of hominids began to use fire systematically enough that it transformed their biology. We know this because the fossil record shows dramatic changes during this period. Brain sizes increasing, gut sizes decreasing, teeth getting smaller, jaw muscles becoming less robust. These changes couldn't happen on a raw food diet. The energetic math doesn't work. The only way to power a larger brain with a smaller gut is to increase the caloric availability of your food. And in the pre-agricultural world, there's only one way to do that at scale: fire. But understanding how that transition actually happened, when our ancestors moved from helpless prey huddling in trees to masters of flame reshaping the world, that's where the story gets really interesting. Imagine being one of our ancestors 1.5 million years ago. You're walking across the African savanna with your small group, maybe 15 or 20 individuals. The dry season has been brutal. Waterholes are disappearing. Game is scarce. Everyone's hungry. Everyone's tired. And everyone's constantly watching the horizon for predators. Then you see it. Smoke rising in thick black columns from the forest ahead. You smell something acrid, terrifying, completely unlike anything in your normal experience. And you hear a sound that makes your blood run cold. A deep crackling roar that seems to be eating the landscape itself. Fire. Every instinct in your body screams, run. And that's exactly what most animals do. You've seen it before, those rare times when lightning strikes during the dry season and ignites the grasslands. Herds of antelope stampeding in panic, lions and hyenas fleeing side by side, predator and prey united in terror. Birds rising in enormous clouds, their cries filling the air. Fire is death. Fire is the thing that consumes everything. Trees that have stood for generations, gone in minutes. Tall grass that provides cover and food, reduced to ash. Animals caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, their charred remains scattered across blackened earth. So, you run. Of course you run. You gather your group and you move away from the smoke, away from the heat, away from the terrible roaring sound. You spend the night in a different part of your territory, huddled together, watching the orange glow on the horizon. But the next day, something makes you come back. Maybe it's hunger. Maybe it's curiosity. Maybe it's just the need to check if your familiar territory is still usable. You approach carefully, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. The landscape is transformed. What was forest is now open ground. What was tall grass is now ash. The air still smells of smoke, and heat rises from patches of ground that are still warm to the touch. But the fire itself is gone. It burned through and moved on, or burned itself out when it reached a river or rocky area with nothing left to consume. Then you notice something else. Bodies. Animals that didn't escape in time, but they're not like the carcasses you're used to finding. These ones smell different. And when you approach one cautiously, expecting it to be burned beyond recognition, you discover something extraordinary. The outside is charred and black, yes. But when you tear into it with your teeth and fingers, the meat inside is different. Softer, easier to chew. And the taste is something entirely new. Richer somehow. More satisfying than any raw meat you've ever eaten. This is the moment. This is when everything changes, even though nobody knows it yet. You're eating cooked meat for the first time in human history. You don't have a word for cooked. You don't understand what heat does to proteins and fats. You just know that this food is better than anything you've tasted before. And you're not alone. Other scavengers have figured it out too. You see other human groups picking through the burned landscape. You see baboons and even some large birds, all taking advantage of this sudden abundance of easily accessible food. For a few days, the usual competition for resources is suspended. There's enough fire-cooked meat for everyone, but then it's gone. The edible carcasses are consumed. Predators and scavengers pick the bones clean. Rain comes and washes away the ash. Within weeks, the landscape begins to recover. Green shoots pushing up through the blackened ground. And the memory of that amazing food begins to fade, except it doesn't fade completely. Some individual in some group somewhere remembers, and the next time they see smoke on the horizon, instead of just running away, they wait. They watch from a safe distance, and when the fire passes, they move in quickly to claim whatever food it left behind. This is the first stage of human fire use. Not control, not creation, just opportunistic exploitation. Following wildfires the way vultures follow predators, waiting for a chance to scavenge whatever the destruction left behind. And this stage lasted a very, very long time. Maybe 500,000 years. Maybe more. The archaeological evidence is frustratingly ambiguous, partly because natural fires and human-controlled fires look similar in the fossil record. A layer of ash with burned bones could be from a wildfire that our ancestors scavenged, or it could be from a campfire they deliberately maintained. But there are clues. Wonderwork Cave in South Africa gives us some of the earliest evidence. Around 1 million years ago, somebody was using fire in that cave. We know this because the ash layers are too consistent, too controlled to be natural. Wildfires don't burn in the same spot repeatedly over thousands of years. Humans maintaining campfires do. At Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, dated to about 790,000 years ago. Archaeologists found something even more telling. Multiple hearths, deliberately constructed fire pits arranged in patterns suggesting organized living spaces, clusters of burned flint tools and animal bones that indicate systematic use of fire for cooking and tool making. This isn't opportunistic scavenging anymore. This is control. But even control isn't creation. There's a huge difference between maintaining fire and making fire. Maintaining fire means you found it somewhere, probably from a lightning strike or volcanic activity, and you kept it alive. You fed it with wood and grass. You protected it from wind and rain. You carried embers with you when you moved camp, keeping them alive in bundled bark or animal dung. Anything that would smolder slowly without flaming out. Creating fire means you can make it appear from nothing. You can take dead wood and rocks or sticks and create flame through friction or percussion. This is a completely different level of mastery, and it probably didn't happen until much later, maybe 400,000 years ago, maybe even more recently. Think about what maintaining fire requires. You need to understand that fire eats fuel. You need to learn that different materials burn differently. Dry grass catches quickly but burns out fast. Hardwood burns slowly and produces long-lasting coals. You need to figure out that fire needs air, that smothering it makes it die, but wind can make it spread dangerously. You need to develop techniques for transporting it, for keeping it alive overnight, for preventing it from escaping and destroying your camp. This is sophisticated knowledge. It requires observation, experimentation, teaching, and learning. It requires a level of cognitive development that earlier human species simply didn't have. The individuals using fire at Wonderwork Cave and Gesher Beno Yaakov weren't modern humans. They were probably Homo erectus, maybe early Heidelbergensis, but they were smart enough to recognize fire's value and capable enough to maintain it once they found it. How many times was this knowledge discovered and lost? How many groups figured out fire maintenance only to lose it when their firekeeper died in an accident, or when heavy rains extinguished their flames and they couldn't find natural fire to restart from? We'll never know exactly, but the patchy archaeological record suggests it happened repeatedly. Because maintaining fire is hard. It requires constant attention. Someone has to wake up in the middle of the night to add fuel. Someone has to stay in camp instead of going on the hunt to protect the flames. Someone has to know exactly how much fuel to add, how to arrange it, how to blow on the coals to bring them back to life. This created new social dynamics. Fire knowledge became valuable. Maybe the most valuable knowledge in the entire group. The person who understood fire best, who could keep it alive through storms and droughts, who could nurse dying embers back to flame, that person had power. Not physical power like the best hunter or fighter, but something potentially more important. The power to provide warmth, light, protection, and access to cooked food. We can imagine conflicts arising. What happens when someone from another group wants your fire? Do you share? Do you trade for it? Do you fight to protect it? What happens when the firekeeper makes demands? Extra food, choice of sleeping spots, priority access to mates. How much authority does fire knowledge grant? The archaeological record can't answer these questions directly, but we see hints. At some sites, hearths are positioned in the center of living spaces, suggesting fire was communal. At others, they're off to the side or at the edges, suggesting more individual control. The variation suggests different groups developed different fire-related social structures. And then there's the controversy, the debate among archaeologists about when fire use truly began. Some point to evidence from nearly 2 million years ago, burned bones and soil that might indicate very early fire use. Others are skeptical, arguing that natural processes can create similar patterns. The scientific debate continues, with new evidence constantly refining our understanding. What's not controversial is that by 400,000 years ago, fire use had become systematic and widespread. Archaeological sites from Africa, Europe, and Asia, all show consistent evidence of controlled fire. Hearths, fire pits, burned tools, deliberately cooked food. Our ancestors, multiple species of them, had figured out fire maintenance and were passing that knowledge down through generations, but they still couldn't create it on demand. They were still dependent on finding natural fire from lightning strikes or volcanic activity. They still had to maintain embers constantly, living in fear of the day when the fire might go out permanently. The transition from maintenance to creation was the final step, and when it happened, probably sometime between 400,000 and 200,000 years ago, it completed the revolution. Our ancestors were no longer dependent on nature's whims. They could make fire anywhere, anytime. They could expand into regions without natural fire sources. They could take risks that would have been unthinkable before. But we're getting ahead of the story. Before fire creation came fire maintenance. And before fire maintenance came that first brave individual who decided to approach the burned landscape instead of fleeing from it, who discovered cooked meat and recognized it as something valuable, who began the long process of observation and experimentation that would eventually give our species control over the most powerful force in nature. That individual's name is lost to time, their specific story unknown, but their legacy surrounds us. Every campfire, every candle, every controlled flame is a direct descendant of that first moment of discovery, when some ancient human looked at fire not as pure terror, but as potential tool. That cognitive shift, that ability to see danger as opportunity, that's what made us human. The fire didn't just warm our bodies, it began warming our minds, expanding our capabilities, transforming us from just another clever ape into something unprecedented in Earth's history. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. It took hundreds of thousands of years, and it required 3 distinct revolutions, each building on the last, each pushing human evolution in new directions. The first revolution was happening in our stomachs, and it would reshape our entire biology. Now here's where things get really interesting. Your ancestors have fire. They can keep it alive, move it from place to place, use it for warmth and protection. But for tens of thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands, they're still basically using it like an expensive security system. Light to keep predators away, heat to survive cold nights. It's useful, absolutely, but it's not revolutionary yet. Then somebody, somewhere, probably completely by accident, discovered something that would change the trajectory of human evolution more profoundly than anything except maybe language itself. They cooked something. Picture the moment. Maybe a scrap of meat falls into the fire during a meal. Someone pulls it out, burns their fingers, drops it in the dirt. Later, when they're desperate enough, they try eating it anyway, and they notice something strange. It tastes better, chews easier, doesn't make them sick like that sketchy raw meat they ate last week. Or maybe it was a root vegetable. Tubers that were bitter and tough when raw, accidentally roasted in the coals, suddenly becoming sweet and soft, easy to digest, easy to share with children and elderly people who couldn't handle tougher foods. However it happened, someone made the connection. Fire plus food equals something fundamentally different. Not just warm food, not just preserved food, transformed food, and that transformation rewrote human biology from the inside out. Let's talk about what cooking actually does. At the molecular level, applying heat to food is like performing chemical surgery. Proteins, those long complex chains of amino acids that make up muscle tissue and plant structures, they're normally twisted and folded into elaborate shapes. When you eat raw meat or raw plants, your digestive system has to work incredibly hard to break down these structures, to unfold the proteins and cut them into pieces small enough to absorb. But heat does this work for you. At around 140 degrees Fahrenheit, proteins start to denature. Their complex structures unfold. The tough resistant fibers break down into simpler forms that your stomach acid and digestive enzymes can attack far more efficiently. The same thing happens with starches. Raw starch molecules are packed into dense granules that are difficult for your body to access. But when you heat them, the granules swell and burst, releasing simple sugars that your intestines can absorb almost immediately. This isn't a minor improvement. This is a revolution in energy extraction. Modern nutritional studies show that cooked food provides 30 to 50% more usable calories than the same food eaten raw. Let that sink in. The same exact piece of meat or root vegetable, just by applying heat, suddenly delivers half again as much energy to your body. For an animal living on the edge of starvation, which describes most of our ancestors most of the time, this is the difference between life and death. This is finding a secret cheat code in the video game of survival. But the caloric explosion was just the beginning. Cooking also kills pathogens, bacteria, parasites, viruses, all the microscopic horrors that turn raw meat into a game of digestive Russian roulette. Heat destroys them. A piece of meat that might have been crawling with dangerous microbes becomes safe to eat after just a few minutes over fire. This meant lower rates of food poisoning, fewer parasitic infections, less energy wasted fighting off pathogens. Your immune system, which normally has to work overtime processing the constant assault of microorganisms from raw food, could suddenly relax a little. That saved energy too. And then there's the detoxification effect. Plants don't want to be eaten. They can't run away, so they defend themselves with chemistry. Toxics, alkaloids, bitter compounds, substances that can make you sick or even kill you. Raw cassava contains cyanide. Raw kidney beans contain lectins that can destroy your intestinal lining. Hundreds of plants that could provide nutrition are literally poisonous when eaten raw. But cooking neutralizes most of these toxins. Heat breaks down the chemical defenses plants use to protect themselves. Suddenly, the entire botanical world opened up to human exploitation. Plants that would have been inedible became staple foods. The range of things your ancestors could eat expanded exponentially. Think about what this meant for survival. Before cooking, your ancestors were limited to foods they could safely digest raw. Certain meats, certain fruits, a limited selection of plants. After cooking, they could eat almost anything. Tough roots, toxic plants, old meat that was starting to turn. Fire made it all accessible. But here's where the story gets truly wild. Because all this extra energy, all these extra calories, all this freed up capacity that your digestive system no longer needed, your body had to do something with it. And evolution, being the ruthlessly efficient optimizer that it is, redirected those resources to the most expensive, most energy-hungry organ in the human body, your brain. This is what anthropologists call the expensive tissue hypothesis. It was proposed by Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler in 1995, and it's one of the most elegant explanations in evolutionary biology. The basic idea is simple. Brains are phenomenally expensive to run. Your brain makes up about 2% of your body weight, but consumes roughly 20% of your total energy budget. It's like running a supercomputer that never sleeps, constantly burning calories even when you're resting. For most animals, this kind of energy demand is impossible to sustain. They need every available calorie just to power their digestive systems, which have to process huge amounts of low-quality food. Gorillas spend 6 to 8 hours a day eating, constantly stuffing vegetation into their mouths to extract enough calories to survive. Their guts are massive, complex, energy-intensive organs. But cooking changed the equation for humans. By pre-digesting food externally with fire, our ancestors could extract more calories while requiring less digestive machinery. The stomach could shrink. The intestines could become shorter and less complex. All that tissue, all that metabolically expensive gut could be reduced. And the energy saved went straight to the brain. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this trade-off became written into human anatomy. Our digestive systems became progressively smaller and simpler. Our brains became progressively larger and more complex. We literally traded gut for brain, inch by inch, neuron by neuron. The fossil record shows this transformation clearly. Early hominids like Australopithecus had relatively small brains, around 450 cubic centimeters, and evidence suggests large, robust digestive systems. Homo erectus, one of the first human species clearly associated with fire use, had brains nearly twice that size. And modern humans, we average around 1,350 cubic centimeters, 3 times the brain capacity of our pre-fire ancestors. This wasn't just about size either. Bigger brains enabled more complex neural networks, more sophisticated information processing, enhanced memory, improved problem-solving abilities. The cognitive toolkit that would eventually let humans dominate the planet was being built, calorie by calorie, neuron by neuron, all funded by the energy surplus that cooking provided. But the biological transformation wasn't limited to internal organs. Cooking also reshaped the human face in ways that are still visible today. Look in a mirror. See those relatively small teeth? Those weak jaws? That graceful bone structure around your mouth? That's the face of a cooking species. Before cooking, human ancestors needed powerful jaws and massive teeth to process raw food. Chewing tough, fibrous vegetation and raw meat required serious mechanical force. Early hominids had dental structures that would look monstrous by modern standards. Huge molars for grinding, prominent brow ridges to anchor massive chewing muscles, thick jaw bones to withstand constant stress. But once food was cooked, all that heavy machinery became unnecessary. Cooked meat tears easily. Cooked vegetables mash into soft pulp. You don't need a hydraulic press of a jaw to eat cooked food. You need something much lighter and more efficient. Over generations, natural selection favored individuals with smaller teeth and weaker jaws, not because those traits were advantageous on their own, but because they represented freed-up resources. The energy that would have gone into building and maintaining massive dental structures could be redirected elsewhere, probably to that growing brain. The skull itself changed shape. Without huge chewing muscles attached to the side of the head, the cranium could expand upward and outward. The distinctive rounded skull of modern humans, so different from the elongated, heavy-browed skulls of our ancestors, is partly a consequence of reduced chewing demands. We quite literally have the faces we do because our ancestors started cooking their food 1,000,000 years ago. But perhaps the most underappreciated revolution cooking brought was temporal. Time itself. Consider how much time it takes to eat. Modern humans eating cooked food typically spend around an hour a day consuming meals. Maybe 2 hours if you're really enjoying yourself. But raw food takes far longer to process. Primates eating raw diets spend 5 to 6 hours a day just chewing. Gorillas, like I mentioned, can spend up to 8 hours eating. That's a third of their entire day, every day, devoted to mechanically breaking down food. Your ancestors, before cooking, faced the same constraint. To get enough calories from raw food to fuel their relatively large brains, they would have needed to spend huge portions of every day eating. Time they couldn't spend making tools, time they couldn't spend planning hunts, time they couldn't spend teaching their children or maintaining social relationships. Cooking broke this constraint. By pre-digesting food with fire, early humans could extract their daily calorie requirements in a fraction of the time. Suddenly, there were hours available, empty hours that could be filled with other activities. Tool making became feasible. You could spend an afternoon carefully crafting a better spear point, because you weren't constantly interrupted by the need to forage and eat. Social bonding became possible. You could sit around the fire with your group, sharing stories and strengthening relationships, while your food cooked itself. This time, liberation might have been just as important as the caloric surplus. Human culture, the accumulation of knowledge across generations, requires time to transmit. Parents teaching children, elders sharing wisdom, skilled individuals demonstrating techniques. All of this takes time that simply wasn't available to species spending half their waking hours chewing. Cooking created that time, and with that time came everything we recognize as distinctly human: art, music, storytelling, elaborate tool traditions, strategic planning, abstract reasoning. All of it became possible because our ancestors weren't spending 6 hours a day mechanically processing raw vegetation. But here's the truly mind-blowing part. This transformation was so complete, so total, that it became irreversible. Modern humans, despite being genetically almost identical to our ancestors from 200,000 years ago, literally cannot survive on raw food alone. Studies of modern raw food enthusiasts show this clearly. Even with access to the best possible raw foods, carefully selected and prepared, with unlimited quantities available, people on strict raw diets consistently lose weight and show signs of chronic energy deficit. Women's reproductive systems shut down. Children fail to develop properly. The human body, shaped by 1,000,000 years of cooked food, simply can't extract enough energy from raw sources to maintain itself. We crossed a point of no return. We became obligate cooks, a species that requires external food processing to survive. Fire transformed from a useful tool into a biological necessity. Our ancestors didn't just learn to cook, they evolved to need cooking. This is unprecedented in the natural world. No other species has ever become dependent on a culturally transmitted technology for basic survival. Birds build nests, beavers build dams, but they could survive without these behaviors if necessary. Humans can't survive without fire, without cooking. The technology became part of our biology. And this transformation, this fundamental rewiring of human existence, happened relatively fast in evolutionary terms. Within maybe 500,000 years of regular fire use, humans had already become significantly dependent on cooking. Within 1,000,000 years, the dependence was complete. Your ancestors weren't just using fire, they were being remade by it. Every generation slightly more dependent, slightly more adapted to cooked food, slightly less capable of surviving without it. Until finally, they became us, a species with small guts, huge brains, weak jaws, and an absolute requirement for fire. The spark that someone captured 1,000,000 years ago didn't just provide warmth and protection. It initiated a biological transformation that created modern humanity. We are quite literally the cooking ape, the species that learned to digest with fire instead of just with our guts. And this was just the first revolution. The biological transformation was profound, but it was also just the beginning. Because once fire became central to human survival, once every group carried embers and kindled flames every evening, something even more remarkable started happening. The night, which had always been humanity's enemy, was about to become our greatest asset. But cooking was just the beginning. Fire was about to solve an even more fundamental problem, one that had constrained every species of human that had ever lived. The problem of darkness. Picture your ancestors before fire. Not just before controlled fire, but before any regular relationship with flame at all. These early humans lived on a strict schedule dictated entirely by the sun. When light faded, their world shrank to almost nothing. They couldn't see predators approaching. They couldn't work. They couldn't travel safely. They could barely even socialize effectively in the dark. So what did they do? They found the best shelter they could. Maybe a cave, maybe a dense thicket. Maybe just a spot against a rock face where they could put their backs to something solid. Then they huddled together and waited for dawn. But they couldn't really sleep. Not deeply. Not the way you sleep in your bed with the doors locked and the lights off. Because the night belonged to predators. Think about what that means. Really think about it. You're sitting in near total darkness. Your visual cortex, which takes up a massive chunk of your brain's processing power, is essentially useless. You can barely see your hand in front of your face, let alone a leopard stalking through the grass 20 feet away. But the leopard sees just fine. Cats have a reflective layer behind their retinas called the tapetum lucidum. It's like a biological mirror that reflects light back through the eye, giving them exceptional night vision. To a leopard, a moonlit night might as well be midday. And leopards weren't the only problem. Hyenas hunted at night. Lions hunted at night. Wild dogs hunted at night. The whole carnivore community had evolved specifically to exploit the darkness, to hunt prey that couldn't see them coming. So your ancestors developed what sleep researchers call sentinel behavior. You've probably seen it if you've ever watched birds or prey animals resting. They don't all sleep at once. Some members of the group stay alert while others rest, then they switch. In human groups, this meant nobody ever got truly deep sleep. There was always part of your brain on guard, always some neural circuits listening for the snap of a twig, the rustle of grass, the low growl that meant something with teeth had found you. This is exhausting. Your brain needs deep sleep to function properly. During deep sleep, your brain consolidates memories, repairs damage, clears out metabolic waste. Without it, cognitive function degrades rapidly. You become irritable, unfocused, prone to mistakes. Over the long term, chronic sleep deprivation causes serious health problems. But our ancestors didn't have a choice. The night was dangerous. Vigilance was mandatory. Evolutionary pressure favored individuals who could function on fragmented sleep, who could snap awake at the slightest sound. This shaped human sleep patterns in ways we can still see today. Modern humans are naturally light sleepers compared to many other primates. We wake easily. We're hyper-alert to unusual sounds during sleep. This isn't a bug in our programming. It's a feature, evolved over millions of years of sleeping while lions prowled in the darkness. Then came fire, and everything changed. The first time an early human group managed to keep a fire burning through the night must have been absolutely transformative. Suddenly you had light, not the dim glow of bioluminescent fungi or the occasional flash of lightning. Real light, steady, reliable, controllable light that pushed back the darkness in a sphere around your camp. But more importantly, you had protection. Because here's what nobody tells you about predators. They're cautious. Evolution doesn't favor reckless behavior. An injured predator is a dead predator. So lions and leopards learned to avoid unnecessary risks. And fire was a risk they wanted nothing to do with. Most mammals have an instinctive fear of fire. It's written into their neural circuitry at a very basic level. Fire means pain. Fire means danger. Fire means flee. This isn't learned behavior. You don't have to teach a lion to avoid flames. They just do. So when your ancestors learned to maintain fires at night, they created something revolutionary. A predator-free zone. A bubble of safety in the middle of the dangerous African night. For the first time in the history of the human lineage, people could relax after sunset. They didn't need constant vigilance. The fire was their sentinel. Any predator approaching the camp would see the flames and veer away. And if one was bold enough or desperate enough to approach despite the fire, the humans would see it coming. The firelight extended their visual range dramatically. Instead of seeing 5 feet in the moonlight, they could now see 20 or 30 feet. That's more than enough warning to grab weapons, add fuel to the fire, make noise to scare off the intruder. The psychological transformation this created cannot be overstated. For the first time ever, humans weren't prey at night. They weren't helpless refugees hiding in the dark. They were the ones in control, the ones with power over their environment. The night was no longer something to be endured. It was something they had conquered. But the benefits went far beyond just safety. Fire literally doubled the amount of usable time in each day. Before fire, darkness meant inactivity. You couldn't make tools because you couldn't see what you were working on. You couldn't process food because you'd cut yourself or make mistakes. You couldn't travel because you'd get lost or fall into a ravine. You could barely even socialize effectively because you couldn't see people's faces, couldn't read their expressions. With fire, all of that changed. Suddenly, the day didn't end at sunset. It extended for hours into the night. You could sit around the fire and continue working. Make tools, repair clothing, process plant fibers into cordage. All the tasks that required manual dexterity and visual acuity could now continue long after the sun went down. But more importantly, you could do something that would prove absolutely critical to human development. You could talk, really talk, extended conversations that lasted for hours. Storytelling, knowledge sharing, planning, negotiating, all of it became possible during these extended evening gatherings around the fire. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies have documented this phenomenon. In groups that maintain traditional practices, the evening gathering around the fire is when the really important social work happens. That's when elders tell stories about the ancestors, when hunters plan the next day's activities, when disputes get resolved, when young people learn the skills and knowledge they'll need as adults, when romantic relationships develop. The fire creates a kind of theater, a focal point that brings people together and facilitates complex social interaction. Before fire, this simply wasn't possible. Humans would have had limited time for extended conversation. Most communication would have happened during the day while foraging or traveling. But activities during the day are distracting. You're watching for predators, looking for food, navigating terrain. Your attention is divided. At night, around a fire, your attention can focus completely on each other. This is where human culture truly began to develop. Not during the busy, distracted daylight hours, but during the quiet, focused evening gatherings. This is where language became more sophisticated, where stories developed, where knowledge accumulated across generations, where the foundations of human civilization were laid, one conversation at a time around countless fires over hundreds of thousands of years. And there was another benefit: sleep quality. Once humans had fire for protection, they didn't need sentinel behavior anymore. The whole group could sleep at once, deeply, the kind of restorative sleep that allows the brain to function at its full capacity. This created a positive feedback loop. Better sleep meant better cognitive function. Better cognitive function meant better problem solving, better tool making, better social organization. Better social organization meant more successful groups that could maintain fires more reliably. More reliable fires meant even better sleep. Round and round, each improvement reinforcing the others. We can see evidence of this in the archaeological record. Sites with clear evidence of controlled fire use also show evidence of increasingly sophisticated cultural practices. More complex tools, better organization, signs of symbolic thinking. The fire and the brain were evolving together, each enabling the other to reach new heights. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of fire wasn't what it did during the night. It was what it did to geography itself. Before fire, humans were essentially tropical animals. Our hairless bodies, our sweat glands, our whole physiology was optimized for hot climates. We could survive in temperate zones during summer, but winter was a serious problem. Without fur, without the ability to hibernate, without fire, cold climates were essentially off-limits. Fire changed that completely. For the first time, humans could create their own microclimate, a sphere of warmth around them regardless of the ambient temperature. This wasn't just comfort. This was survival. The human body functions optimally within a very narrow temperature range. Get too cold and your metabolism slows down, your thinking becomes sluggish, your fingers lose dexterity. Eventually you die. But with fire, you could maintain body temperature indefinitely. You could sleep through freezing nights. You could work during cold days. You could venture into territories that would have been lethal without flame. This unlocked entire continents. Northern Europe, Northern Asia, eventually North America, all became accessible to humans because of fire. Species that couldn't control fire remained trapped in tropical and subtropical zones. But humans with fire could go anywhere, and they did. The archaeological evidence shows human expansion into temperate and even cold climates correlates almost perfectly with evidence of fire use. The two are inseparable. Fire didn't just help humans move north, it made moving north possible. And this wasn't just about survival. It was about opportunity. Northern latitudes offered resources that tropical zones didn't have. Massive herds of large mammals, abundant fish in cold rivers, different plants, different stones for tool making, different opportunities for human groups willing to brave the cold. With fire, they could. The groups that moved north weren't refugees fleeing overcrowding in the south. They were pioneers, entrepreneurs, taking advantage of fire technology to exploit untapped resources. They were expanding the human niche from a narrow tropical band to essentially the entire planet. But every advantage comes with trade-offs. As humans became dependent on fire for warmth and protection, they also became vulnerable in new ways. Lose your fire in a cold climate, and you're in serious trouble. Let your fire go out at night in predator territory, and you're back to being prey. This created intense selection pressure for groups that could maintain fire reliably. The archaeological record shows increasingly sophisticated fire management techniques over time: better hearth construction, stone rings to contain flames, evidence of fire maintenance, careful banking of coals overnight so they could be rekindled easily in the morning. These weren't just practical skills, they were survival skills. Groups that couldn't maintain fire didn't last long in challenging environments. Groups that could become the ancestors of everyone who came after. We're all descendants of the firekeepers, all products of hundreds of thousands of years of selection for fire management ability. It's written into our psychology. The comfort we feel around flames, the almost hypnotic fascination we have with watching fire, the instinctive satisfaction of tending a fire, adding fuel, adjusting the flames. But fire had given humans something even more precious than warmth and protection. It had given them time to think, time to talk, time to develop the complex social bonds and cultural knowledge that would eventually separate us from every other species on the planet. The night shift had begun, and humanity would never be the same, but something else was happening around those flames, something that would matter just as much as the nutritional revolution, maybe even more. Fire was turning us into social creatures in ways no other species had ever experienced. Think about fire for a moment. Really think about it. It's not just a cooking tool. It's not just a predator deterrent. Fire is a magnetic force. It draws you in. Even today, with central heating and electric lights, people still gather around campfires, backyard fire pits, fireplaces. There's something hypnotic about flames. Something that makes us want to sit close, stare into the dancing light, and just be together. For your ancestors a million years ago, this magnetic quality of fire created something unprecedented in the natural world. The hearth, the first human institution, the original social center. Before fire, your ancestors would have spent their evenings like other primates do, scattered, nervous, huddled in trees or caves, trying to stay safe until dawn. Social interaction after dark was basically impossible. You couldn't see faces, couldn't read expressions, couldn't communicate effectively. So you just endured the night alone or in silent clusters waiting for sunrise. Fire changed everything. Suddenly, darkness wasn't the end of social time. It was the beginning of something entirely new. Picture a typical evening 800,000 years ago. Your group of maybe 20 people has spent the day foraging, hunting, processing food. As the sun drops toward the horizon, instead of scrambling for sleeping spots, they converge on the fire. The flames are already burning. Someone kept them alive through the day, adding fuel periodically, protecting the embers. This itself required a level of responsibility and forward thinking that was completely new in the animal kingdom. As twilight fades, the fire becomes the only light source. Everyone naturally arranges themselves in a circle around it, not because someone told them to. The physics of firelight simply creates this configuration. You want to be close enough to see and be warm, but not so close you get burned. You end up facing each other across the flames, and there you sit, for hours, with nothing to do but look at each other and communicate. This was revolutionary. Anthropologists estimate that fire gave our ancestors an extra 4 to 5 hours of social time every single day. Think about that accumulation. 4 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, generation after generation. That's thousands of hours of additional face-to-face social interaction per person, per year. But it wasn't just quantity, it was quality. The hearth created a completely unique social environment. During the day, your ancestors were busy. Foraging required attention. Hunting demanded focus. Tool-making took concentration. Social interaction happened, sure, but it was fragmented, purposeful, task-oriented. Around the fire, people could just be together. The work was done, the food was cooking, nothing required immediate attention. For the first time in primary evolution, individuals could engage in sustained, relaxed, face-to-face social interaction without any other pressure or purpose. This is where storytelling was born, not as entertainment, though it became that, as necessity. Humans are meaning-making machines, and when you give us hours of social time with nothing else to do, we start constructing narratives. Imagine you're sitting around that fire. Someone gestures toward the darkness and makes sounds describing the animal they saw today. Not just warning sounds, detailed sounds, descriptive sounds. They're trying to communicate something complex, where the animal was, how big it was, whether it seemed dangerous or edible. Others listen intently. Someone else adds information. Maybe they saw the same animal yesterday in a different location. Now you're tracking patterns, predicting behavior, planning tomorrow's activities based on shared information. This isn't instinct. This is culture. Knowledge being transferred through communication rather than genetics. And it's happening because fire gave you the time and the setting to make it possible. But storytelling evolved beyond practical information sharing. It became something stranger, more abstract. People started describing things that happened in the past, not yesterday, but seasons ago, years ago. They told stories about ancestors who were no longer alive, about places they'd been when they were younger, about dangers they'd survived and lessons they'd learned. This required a cognitive leap that still makes scientists scratch their heads. You have to understand that other people have mental states, that they can hold information you don't have, that their past experiences which you didn't witness can be valuable to you in the present. Psychologists call this theory of mind, the ability to model other people's thoughts and perspectives. It's something humans excel at and most other animals struggle with, and the evidence suggests it evolved primarily around fires. Why? Because firelight gatherings created the perfect environment for theory of mind to develop. You're sitting there for hours, watching faces flicker in and out of the light. You start noticing expressions. This person looks worried. That person seems excited. Over time, you get better at reading these subtle cues. You start predicting behavior, understanding motivation, anticipating what someone might do based on what you think they're thinking. Natural selection would have strongly favored individuals good at this. Someone who could understand group dynamics would navigate social relationships more successfully. They'd form better alliances, avoid conflicts, gain status, and they'd be more likely to survive and reproduce. Over thousands of generations, human theory of mind became extraordinarily sophisticated. We became the mind-reading apes, not telepathic, but remarkably good at inferring thoughts, intentions, and emotions from minimal cues. All because fire gave us thousands of hours to practice. And then there's language, the big one. The adaptation that really sets humans apart from every other species on Earth. We don't know exactly when fully modern language evolved. Probably not all at once, more likely gradually, over hundreds of thousands of years. But we're increasingly certain that fire accelerated the process dramatically. Here's why. Language isn't just useful, it's incredibly complex. The grammar rules, the vocabulary, the subtle meanings, the ability to discuss abstract concepts and things that aren't immediately present. All of this requires massive cognitive machinery. Your brain dedicates huge amounts of processing power to language, more than to almost anything else you do. For such a costly adaptation to evolve, it needs to provide enormous benefits, and those benefits need to be used constantly, not just occasionally. You need situations where communication is so important that people with slightly better language skills have significantly better survival and reproduction rates. The cooking hypothesis for language evolution argues that fire created exactly these conditions. Cooking isn't simple. It requires planning, coordination, and precise timing. You need to gather fuel, keep the fire burning at the right temperature, monitor the food, decide when it's done, share the results fairly. Try doing all that without language. It's possible, sure. Other primates coordinate activities, but it's clumsy, inefficient. You make mistakes. Food gets burned or undercooked. Resources get wasted. Conflicts emerge over distribution. Now imagine a group where individuals can discuss these activities, where someone can say, in whatever proto-language they're using, that the fire needs more wood, where another person can indicate that the food smells like it's almost ready, where the group can agree in advance how the meal will be divided. That group wastes less food, shares more fairly, cooperates more effectively, and they survive better than groups that can't coordinate as well. Over time, the groups with better communication skills outcompete those with worse communication. Language abilities improve generation by generation, but it goes deeper than practical coordination. The social aspects of cooking might have been even more important for language evolution, because cooking wasn't just about nutrition, it was about culture. Every human society that's ever been studied has food-sharing rituals. Shared meals are sacred time. They're when families bond, when alliances form, when courtship happens, when social hierarchies get negotiated. The dinner table, whether it's an actual table or just a space around a fire, is where human social life unfolds. This pattern is so universal it has to be ancient, and it has to trace back to those early fires. When your ancestors started cooking food, they also started sharing it in ritualized ways, not just grabbing and eating individually like other primates, but distributing portions, observing protocols, using the meal as a social event. These rituals required language to maintain. You need to communicate expectations, explain traditions to children, negotiate who gets what portion and why, resolve disputes when someone feels they've been treated unfairly. Without sophisticated communication, the whole system breaks down. So, fire selected for language ability, not just the practical language of coordination, but the social language of relationship building, tradition maintenance, and cultural transmission. And once you have that kind of language, everything changes, because now you can teach, not just show someone how to do something and hope they figure it out, but actually explain, describe the reasoning behind techniques, warn about dangers they haven't encountered yet, share knowledge accumulated over lifetimes. Around the fire at night, elders could transmit decades of knowledge to younger generations, which plants were edible and which were poisonous, where water sources could be found during dry seasons, how to predict weather patterns, when certain animals migrated, how to navigate by stars. This intergenerational knowledge transfer created cultural continuity. Each generation built on what the previous one had learned instead of starting from scratch. Knowledge accumulated, techniques improved, culture became cumulative. And this is why humans exploded across the planet while other smart animals stayed relatively limited. Other species had to rely on instinct and individual learning. Humans could package thousands of years of collective knowledge into teachable lessons transmitted around fires. But fire's social revolution went even further. It changed how we bonded with each other, especially romantically. Every human culture practices some form of shared meals between partners. Dating involves dinner. Marriages include feasts. Anniversaries center on special meals together. This isn't random, it's ancient. Pair bonding in humans is unusually strong compared to most primates. Most apes don't form lasting partnerships. Humans do. And the evidence suggests this shift happened alongside the adoption of cooking. When your ancestors started investing time in preparing food, sharing meals became an intimate act. Cooking for someone signaled investment. Sharing scarce resources showed commitment. Around the fire, couples could sit together away from the main group. They could talk without being overheard. They could strengthen bonds through thousands of hours of quiet companionship. This intimacy was new in the primate world, and it helped create the stable partnerships that became the foundation of human family structure. Fire also enabled something even stranger: ritual, symbolism, the beginnings of what we might call spirituality, because fire itself became sacred. In every human culture ever documented, fire holds special meaning. It's treated with respect, often with reverence. There are rituals around lighting fires, maintaining them, extinguishing them. Fire appears in origin stories, in religious ceremonies, in rites of passage. This universality suggests something deep. Our ancestors didn't just use fire, they developed a relationship with it, an emotional, almost spiritual connection, and it makes sense. Fire kept them alive, protected them, fed them, brought them together. It was the center of their world, the one constant in a dangerous, changing landscape. Around fires, the first human rituals probably emerged. Maybe someone noticed that certain actions seemed to make hunts more successful, not because of any real causal connection, but just random correlation. They started repeating those actions. Others joined in. Over time, these became traditions, ceremonies, the earliest forms of what we call religion. All of this, every bit of it, traces back to that simple fact. Fire is magnetic. It draws us together. And when it drew our ancestors together night after night, year after year, millennium after millennium, it transformed us from smart apes into something entirely new. Social creatures capable of cooperation at scales no other species could match. Storytellers who could transmit knowledge across generations. Symbolic thinkers who could create meaning and purpose beyond mere survival. The fire made us human, but the hearth made us humanity. A collective, a culture, a species that survived not just through individual adaptation, but through shared knowledge, coordinated action, and social bonds strong enough to face anything the world could throw at us. And we were going to need those bonds, because what came next would test them like nothing before. But here's where the story gets really wild. Because fire didn't just give us cooked food and protection from predators, it literally rebuilt our brains from the inside out. Picture this. You're looking at a Homo habilis skull from 2 million years ago. Small, compact brain capacity around 600 cubic centimeters. That's roughly the size of a large orange. Now look at a modern human skull. Brain capacity around 1,400 cubic centimeters, more than twice as large. And if you track the timeline of when these changes happened, they map almost perfectly onto the timeline of fire control. This wasn't coincidence. This was the most dramatic neurological transformation in mammalian history, and it happened in evolutionary terms incredibly fast. Something was driving an explosive expansion of human brain tissue. Something was making bigger, more energy-hungry brains not just viable, but actually advantageous enough that natural selection kept pushing for more. That something was fire. But to understand how fire created the superbrain, we need to talk about the most expensive organ in your body. Your brain represents about 2% of your body weight, but it consumes roughly 20% of your daily calories. In infants, it's even more extreme. A baby's brain can use up to 60% of the calories they consume. This creates what biologists call an energetic constraint. You simply cannot evolve a bigger brain unless you can reliably provide it with enough energy to function. Before fire, this constraint was absolute. Our ancestors could only support brains of a certain size because their digestive systems could only extract a certain amount of energy from raw food. It's like trying to run a supercomputer on a 9-volt battery. The hardware might be capable of amazing things, but without sufficient power, it's useless. Fire removed that constraint. Suddenly, the same amount of food could provide dramatically more calories. The same digestive system could support a much more energy-hungry brain. Natural selection responded immediately. Any mutation that increased brain size, particularly in regions associated with planning, social cognition, and tool use, suddenly became massively advantageous. Within a few 100,000 years, human brain size began expanding at a rate unprecedented in evolutionary history. But it wasn't just getting bigger, it was being fundamentally restructured. The most dramatic changes happened in the prefrontal cortex, the region right behind your forehead. This is your brain's executive control center, responsible for planning, impulse control, abstract thinking, and social reasoning. In other primates, is relatively small. In humans, it's massively expanded, taking up a much larger proportion of total brain volume than in any other species. And here's the thing. Fire control requires exactly the cognitive abilities managed by the prefrontal cortex. Think about what's involved in maintaining a fire. You need to plan ahead, gathering fuel before the current supply runs out. You need impulse control, resisting the urge to use all your firewood at once, even when you're cold. You need to understand abstract concepts like fuel efficiency and heat management. You need to think about the future, considering what might happen tomorrow if you let the fire die tonight. Every time one of your ancestors sat by a fire and made decisions about fuel management, they were exercising their prefrontal cortex. And individuals with slightly better executive function, slightly better planning abilities, slightly more impulse control, they were the ones whose fires didn't go out. They were the ones who stayed warm, kept predators away, and had cooked food ready when they needed it. Over thousands of generations, this created intense selection pressure for enhanced prefrontal function. The individuals with bigger, more sophisticated prefrontal cortexes survived more often, reproduced more successfully, and passed those traits on to their children. Fire was literally selecting for the cognitive abilities required to control fire. It was a feedback loop. Better fire control supported bigger brains. Bigger brains enabled better fire control, which supported even bigger brains. But brain size alone doesn't tell the whole story. The quality of brain tissue matters just as much as the quantity. And here's where cooked food really becomes critical. Your brain is about 60% fat. Not the kind of fat that jiggles, but structural fat, the lipids that make up cell membranes and allow neurons to communicate effectively. The most important of these fats is DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. This long-chain omega-3 fatty acid is absolutely essential for brain development and function. Without adequate DHA, cognitive development is impaired, sometimes severely. The problem is, DHA is hard to come by in nature. The best sources are seafood and fatty meat from wild animals, but raw seafood is dangerous, full of parasites and bacteria. Raw meat, especially organ meat where DHA concentrates, is tough to digest and also potentially contaminated. Before fire, getting adequate DHA required taking serious health risks. After fire, everything changed. Cooked seafood is not only safe, it's one of the most nutrient-dense foods available. Cooked fatty meat becomes highly digestible, and cooking actually makes DHA more bioavailable, easier for your gut to absorb. Suddenly, the nutrients required for building bigger, better brains were abundantly available in forms your ancestors' digestive systems could handle. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Sites showing intensive fire use often also show evidence of systematic seafood consumption. Shell middens near ancient hearths, fish bones in cooking pits. Your ancestors weren't just eating whatever they could catch. They were specifically targeting foods rich in the nutrients their expanding brains required. And there's another factor we need to talk about, something that sounds unglamorous but was absolutely critical. Parasites. Before fire, your ancestors were constantly infected with intestinal parasites, worms, protozoans, bacteria, all consuming nutrients and producing toxins. Modern studies of wild primates show they typically carry multiple parasitic infections simultaneously. These parasites don't just steal calories, they actively impair cognitive function, producing inflammation in the gut that affects brain chemistry. They drain resources that could otherwise go to neural development. Fire killed these parasites. Thoroughly cooked food is essentially sterile, free of the eggs and larvae that would otherwise reinfect people with each meal. Within a generation of adopting cooking, human populations would have experienced a dramatic reduction in parasitic load. Suddenly, all those calories and nutrients that were going to feeding intestinal worms could be redirected to building and maintaining brain tissue. The effect would have been immediate and dramatic. Children growing up with less parasitic stress would develop more robust neural networks. Adults suffering less from chronic inflammation would think more clearly, remember better, solve problems more effectively. This wasn't a subtle advantage. This was a fundamental transformation of human cognitive capacity. But the superbrain wasn't just getting bigger and better nourished. It was being reorganized to handle an entirely new category of challenges: social challenges. Here's something fascinating. As human brain size expanded, the neocortex grew disproportionately fast. This is the outer layer of the brain, heavily involved in conscious thought, sensory processing, and especially social cognition. In humans, the neocortex is absolutely massive compared to other primates. Anthropologists have found a strong correlation between neocortex size and social group size across primate species. Bigger social groups require bigger neocortexes to manage all the relationships, alliances, and social information. Chimps with social groups of about 50 individuals have appropriately sized neocortexes. Humans, who can maintain stable social relationships with 150 to 200 people, have dramatically enlarged ones, and fire created the conditions for these larger social groups. Those extended evening gatherings around the hearth weren't just entertainment, they were cognitive training sessions. Every night your ancestors practiced reading facial expressions in flickering firelight, interpreting tone of voice, tracking who said what to whom, managing the complex social dynamics of group living. Children growing up around fires were exposed to a level of social information unprecedented in primate evolution. They heard stories about people they'd never met, learned about events that happened before they were born, absorbed the accumulated social knowledge of their entire community. Their developing brains had to process all this information, creating neural networks capable of managing social complexity far beyond what any other species had ever attempted. Natural selection responded by favoring individuals with enhanced social cognitive abilities. People who could read others more accurately, predict social consequences more reliably, and navigate group politics more skillfully. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this created what neuroscientists now recognize as uniquely human social intelligence. And there's one more piece to this puzzle, one that changed everything about how human childhood works: the grandmother hypothesis. Most mammals have a simple life pattern: grow up, reproduce, die. Once females can no longer reproduce, natural selection stops caring about them. There's no evolutionary advantage to living past reproductive age. But human females routinely live decades beyond menopause. Why? Fire changed the economics of survival. Before fire, food preparation was relatively simple. Find something, eat it raw. But with fire, food preparation became complex and time-consuming. Gathering fuel, maintaining flames, monitoring cooking, processing foods to maximize nutritional value. These tasks required knowledge, experience, and attention. Older women, past their own reproductive years, suddenly had a new role. They could maintain fires, prepare food, and free up younger women to have more children. More importantly, they could accumulate and pass on knowledge: which plants were good fuel, how to keep fires going in rain, what foods needed longer cooking, how to manage household resources. Genetic analysis suggests that the grandmother effect became significant around the time fire use became universal. Populations with longer-lived, Post-reproductive females had higher survival rates for their grandchildren. The genes for extended lifespan and post-reproductive health began spreading rapidly. This created yet another feedback loop. Grandmothers meant children had more time for learning, less time spent scrambling for survival. Extended childhoods allowed more time for brain development, more time for neurons to form complex networks, more time for cultural knowledge to be transmitted. Human childhood became extraordinarily long compared to other primates, and much of that extended development time was spent around fires, learning from elders who wouldn't have survived without fire's transformative effects. All these factors together created what neuroscientists call enhanced neuroplasticity. The human brain became not just bigger, but more flexible, more capable of adapting to new challenges, learning new skills, rewiring itself in response to experience. And fire created the perfect environment for developing neuroplasticity. Think about the diversity of activities that happened around fires. Tool making, requiring fine motor skills and spatial reasoning. Storytelling, developing language and memory. Cooking, involving planning and sequential reasoning. Social interaction, exercising emotional intelligence. Every evening was a cognitive workout, exercising different neural systems in different ways. Modern neuroscience shows that diverse cognitive challenges create more robust, flexible brains. Brains that can adapt to novelty, learn new skills quickly, and transfer knowledge between domains. Your ancestors, spending their evenings engaged in diverse activities around fires, were developing exactly this kind of adaptive intelligence. Within a few 100,000 years, this created a brain unlike anything evolution had produced before, not just bigger, but fundamentally different in its capabilities. A superbrain capable of symbolic thought, abstract reasoning, language, art, mathematics, everything that makes human cognition unique. And it all traced back to that first controlled fire, that first decision to not just use fire opportunistically, but to maintain it, control it, make it a permanent part of human life. The superbrain wasn't a gift from the gods or a lucky mutation. It was the inevitable result of hundreds of thousands of years of living with fire. Every generation, natural selection favored individuals whose brains were slightly better suited to the cognitive demands of fire-based living, slightly better at planning, social reasoning, impulse control, technical skill. Multiply those slight advantages across 10,000 generations, and you get the most sophisticated cognitive organ in the known universe. You get the human brain, the superbrain. And once that superbrain existed, everything else became possible. Here's what most people don't realize about fire. It wasn't just about keeping warm or cooking food. Fire was the gateway technology, the master key that unlocked every other human advancement. Once your ancestors learned to control it, they didn't just survive better, they started reshaping the entire planet. Let's start with tools. Before fire, tool making was limited by the materials available. You could chip stone, you could sharpen bone, you could maybe split wood if you were lucky. But fire changed everything. Because fire doesn't just consume, it transforms. The first innovation was probably accidental. Someone left a wooden spear near the fire too long. Instead of burning up, the tip hardened. The heat had driven out moisture, condensed the wood fibers, created something dramatically stronger than raw wood. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a revolution. A fire-hardened spear point could punch through thick hide that would have deflected a regular wooden spear. It could penetrate deeper, cause more damage, bring down larger prey. Suddenly, animals that had been too dangerous or too tough to hunt regularly became viable targets. Your ancestors didn't miss the significance. Within generations, fire hardening became standard practice. Archaeological sites from 400,000 years ago show clear evidence of systematic fire treatment of wooden tools, not random burning, but controlled exposure to heat at specific temperatures for specific durations. This required understanding. You had to know that too much heat would char and weaken the wood, Too little would have no effect. You needed to hold the tool at just the right distance from the flames, rotate it evenly, maintain the perfect temperature. This was chemistry. This was materials engineering. This was science, practiced by people who had never heard those words but understood the principles nonetheless. But wooden tools were just the beginning. Fire also revolutionized stone tool production. Heating certain types of stone before chipping them made the material more predictable, easier to shape, capable of producing sharper edges. Flint heated to around 350 degrees Celsius becomes significantly easier to work. The internal structure changes, allowing tool makers to create thinner, more sophisticated implements. By 70,000 years ago, your ancestors in Africa were using fire to produce composite tools that would have seemed like magic to earlier humans. Heat-treated stone blades hafted to wooden handles with plant resin adhesives that had been cooked to exactly the right consistency. These weren't crude implements anymore. These were precision instruments, each component carefully processed and assembled. This is manufacturing at a level that wouldn't be matched again until the Bronze Age. And that brings us to metals. The discovery that certain rocks, when heated to extreme temperatures, would melt and reform into workable material was probably another accident. But it was an accident that could only happen to a species that had been using fire intensively for hundreds of thousands of years. Someone, somewhere, built a particularly hot fire on ground that happened to contain copper ore. The next morning they found small beads of shiny metal in the ashes. That moment of discovery, whenever it happened, led eventually to the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Industrial Revolution. All of human metallurgy, all of modern technology, traces back to people who noticed that fire could turn rocks into something new. But fire's most profound impact wasn't on tools, it was on geography. Before fire, or your ancestors were restricted to warm climates. They were tropical animals, poorly adapted to cold. They could survive in temperate zones during summer, but winter pushed them south, back toward the equator. Fire changed that equation completely. With fire, humans could survive anywhere. The coldest nights, the harshest winters, none of it mattered if you could maintain a flame. This unleashed a migration that would eventually put human footprints on every continent except Antarctica. Think about what this means. Other species are limited by their biology. Polar bears need thick fur and fat deposits to survive Arctic cold. They can't live in tropical heat. Lions need warm climates. They can't survive northern winters. Each species has its range, its ecological niche, determined by millions of years of evolution. But humans with fire could adapt to any environment in a single generation. No genetic changes needed. No waiting for natural selection. Just knowledge, passed from parent to child, about how to make and maintain fire. Around 45,000 years ago, modern humans pushed into northern Europe and Asia during one of the coldest periods of the last ice age. Average winter temperatures in some regions were 20 degrees Celsius colder than today. Summers were brief and unpredictable. This was Neanderthal territory, and the Neanderthals were perfectly adapted to it. They had robust bodies that conserved heat, enlarged nasal passages that warmed frigid air, massive muscle mass that generated body heat. They were biological furnaces, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in Ice Age Europe. Your ancestors had none of these adaptations. They were basically tropical Africans, lean-bodied and poorly insulated. They should have frozen to death in the first winter, but they had fire. Not just fire for warmth, but sophisticated fire management that let them create livable spaces in the most hostile environments imaginable. They built structures around hearths, creating microclimates warm enough for survival. They learned to keep fires burning continuously through long winters. They developed technologies for transporting fire, carrying embers in specially prepared containers so they could maintain flames even while traveling. The Neanderthals watched these newcomers spreading across their territories, and they must have wondered how these thin-bodied strangers could possibly survive. But survive they did. More than survive, they thrived. And this gets to something crucial about fire and human dominance. Fire didn't just let humans survive in new places, it gave them an advantage over species that were biologically better adapted. Neanderthals needed to eat enormous amounts of meat to fuel their massive bodies. Estimates suggest an adult male Neanderthal required about 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day just to maintain body weight. Your ancestors, with their smaller, more efficient bodies and fire-cooked food, that was easier to digest, needed significantly less. Maybe 2,500 to 3,000 calories. Same environment, same resources, but modern humans could support larger populations on the same food base. Fire also let humans exploit resources Neanderthals couldn't access efficiently. Plant foods that were toxic or indigestible raw could be detoxified and softened through cooking. Bones that Neanderthals would gnaw for marrow could be cracked open more easily after fire treatment. Even water sources could be made safer by boiling, reducing disease risk. Every fire-enabled advantage was small by itself, but they compounded. Over thousands of years of direct competition, modern humans could support more people, maintain larger social networks, and pass down more accumulated knowledge. The Neanderthals, despite being stronger, cold adapted, and established in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, couldn't compete with that. By 40,000 years ago, they were in decline. By 30,000 years ago, they were extinct. But fire did something else, something that would prove even more transformative. It let humans become engineers of entire ecosystems. Your ancestors figured out early that fire wasn't just a tool for working materials or staying warm. It was a tool for reshaping landscapes. Controlled burning could clear forests, creating grasslands that attracted grazing animals. It could prevent brush buildup, reducing the risk of catastrophic wildfires. It could encourage the growth of specific plants while eliminating others. This was ecology. This was environmental management at a scale no other species had ever attempted. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples have been using fire to manage landscapes for at least 50,000 years. They practice what they call cool burning, low-intensity fires set during specific seasons to clear undergrowth without damaging larger trees. This creates a mosaic landscape, patches of different vegetation types at different stages of regrowth. The result is incredible biodiversity and sustainable game populations. This isn't random burning. This is sophisticated environmental engineering based on deep understanding of fire ecology, plant responses, and animal behavior. In North America, indigenous peoples used fire to create and maintain vast grasslands that supported massive bison herds. When European colonizers arrived and suppressed these burning practices, forests began reclaiming the grasslands within decades. What the colonizers thought was pristine wilderness was actually a carefully managed landscape, shaped by thousands of years of deliberate burning. In Africa, controlled burning has been shaping savannas for hundreds of thousands of years. Some ecologists now think the African savanna itself, the landscape where humans evolved, is partly a human creation. Our ancestors using fire to maintain open grasslands where they could see predators and hunt large game more effectively. If this is true, it means humans didn't just adapt to their environment. They created it. They terraformed their own cradle. This feedback loop is crucial to understanding how fire made us human. Better fire control led to better nutrition. Better nutrition supported larger brains. Larger brains enabled more sophisticated fire use, more complex tools, better hunting strategies. These advantages supported larger populations. Larger populations meant more innovation, more accumulated knowledge, more pressure to develop even better technologies. Each advancement created conditions that favored further advancement. Consider population growth. Before fire and cooking, early humans probably lived in small, unstable groups, similar to modern chimpanzees. Bands of maybe 20 to 40 individuals, rarely staying in one place for long. High infant mortality, frequent starvation, populations that rose and fell with resource availability. But fire changed the equation. Cooked food meant better nutrition for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Warm, protected campsites reduced infant mortality. The ability to preserve and store food through smoking and drying meant less starvation during lean periods. By 100,000 years ago, human population structures were fundamentally different from any other primate. Groups were larger, more stable, more permanently settled around reliable fire-keeping sites. Archaeological evidence shows continuous occupation of certain caves and rock shelters for thousands of years. These weren't just temporary camps anymore. These were homes, places where multiple generations lived, died, and passed down knowledge. Larger, more stable populations accelerated innovation. More people meant more potential inventors. More generations living in the same place meant better knowledge preservation. Children learning not just from parents, but from grandparents, accumulating decades of experience. This is what anthropologists call the ratchet effect. Each generation builds on the previous one's knowledge, and the achievements don't slip backward. You don't have to reinvent fire-making or spear hardening every generation. It's passed down, refined, improved. By 10,000 years ago, this fire-enabled ratchet had brought humans to the brink of the agricultural revolution. But here's what's interesting. Agriculture wasn't a sudden invention. It was the culmination of tens of thousands of years of fire-based landscape management. Your ancestors had been using fire to encourage useful plants for millennia. They knew that burning cleared land, enriched soil with ash, and promoted new growth. They understood that certain plants responded to fire by producing more seeds, growing back more vigorously. They had observed for generations how disturbed ground around campsites produced abundant edible plants. When the climate stabilized after the last ice age, people in multiple regions independently made the leap from encouraging wild plants to deliberately planting them. But this wasn't a leap into the unknown. It was the logical extension of fire-based ecosystem management they'd been practicing for 50,000 years. Agriculture emerged from a deep understanding of how fire, plants, and soil interact, knowledge that could only have been accumulated through millennia of experimentation. And once agriculture emerged, it created yet another feedback loop. Farming supported larger, denser populations. These populations required more intensive land management, more burning to clear fields, maintain pastures, prevent forest encroachment. Within a few thousand years, human-set fires were reshaping entire continents. The Amazon rainforest shows evidence of extensive pre-Columbian burning and management. The forests of Europe were largely cleared by Bronze Age farmers using fire and axes. The grasslands of Central Asia were maintained by nomadic peoples using systematic burning practices. Humans had become the first species in Earth's history to fundamentally reshape planetary ecology through tool use, not through biological processes like photosynthetic bacteria, but through technology, through the controlled application of energy, which is ultimately what fire is. And all of it traces back to those first moments when your ancestors figured out how to keep a flame alive, how to make it work for them instead of just fleeing from it. This is fire's true legacy, not just warmth or cooked food, but the beginning of humanity's transformation from one species among millions to the dominant force on Earth. The species that would eventually split atoms, send rockets to the moon, and reshape the planetary climate itself. All of it beginning with a simple innovation: the control of combustion, the mastery of flame, the moment when humans stopped being subject to nature and started being its architects. But that mastery came at a cost and carried implications that your ancestors couldn't possibly have foreseen. We're still living with them today. Here's something strange. You're sitting at home right now, probably in a climate-controlled building with electric lights, central heating, and food that came from a refrigerator. You have no practical need for fire, none whatsoever. But if I told you there was a campfire burning outside or a fireplace crackling in the next room, part of you would want to go sit by it. Not because you're cold, not because you need to cook, just because. Why? The answer is written in your DNA, carved into your neural pathways by 1 million years of evolution. Fire isn't just a tool your ancestors used. It's the technology that made you human, and your brain remembers. Scientists have actually studied this. Researchers at the University of Alabama took people into laboratories and showed them videos of different things: running water, trees swaying in wind, city streets, television static, and fire, just flames dancing and flickering. Then they measured what happened to people's bodies. Blood pressure dropped when they watched fire. Heart rate slowed. Brain activity shifted into patterns associated with relaxation and meditation. But here's the fascinating part. The effect was dose-dependent. Bigger fires created stronger responses, and the response was universal. Didn't matter where the subjects came from, what culture they belonged to, whether they'd grown up around campfires or never seen a real flame in their lives. Everyone reacted the same way. Their bodies recognized fire as something safe, something good, something that meant home. This isn't learned behavior. Babies too young to have any cultural conditioning about fire are drawn to flames, mesmerized by their movement. Ancient peoples on every continent, from the Arctic to the Amazon, from Australian Aboriginal communities to Siberian hunter-gatherers, developed rituals around firekeeping. The hearth was sacred everywhere, always. Because for hundreds of thousands of years, fire meant survival. It meant you would eat. It meant you would be warm. It meant predators would stay away. It meant your group could gather together in the darkness and share food, stories, knowledge. Your ancestors, who felt most comforted by fire, who were most drawn to tend it and sit beside it, they were the ones who survived. The ones who didn't care about fire, who wandered away from the flames into the cold darkness. They got eaten by leopards or died of hypothermia. Their genes didn't make it. So you inherited a brain that finds fire irresistibly compelling, a nervous system that calms down when flames are near, an emotional architecture built around the assumption that fire equals safety, community, and nourishment. This is why we still create fires when we don't need them. When was the last time you went camping? If you did, you probably built a campfire even though you had a perfectly good propane stove for cooking and a sleeping bag for warmth. You sat around that fire for hours just staring at it. Maybe you toasted marshmallows, but mostly you just watched the flames and talked. Or didn't talk. Just sat there, feeling something you couldn't quite name. That something is evolutionary memory. For a few hours, you were living like your ancestors did for 1 million years. Small group, circle of firelight, darkness pressing in from all sides, food cooking, the primal satisfaction of tending flames, adding wood, maintaining the perfect balance between too much fuel and not enough. Your brain recognized the pattern and said, yes, this is how humans are supposed to live. Fireplaces serve the same function. They're wildly inefficient for heating. Central heating is cheaper, more effective, and far easier. But people pay thousands of dollars to install fireplaces in their homes, or tens of thousands for real wood-burning units. Then they spend winter evenings burning perfectly good lumber for no practical reason whatsoever. Just to watch it burn. Just to feel right. Real estate agents know this. Homes with fireplaces sell faster, and for more money than identical homes without them. Even non-functional decorative fireplaces increase property values. Even electric fireplaces with fake flames trigger some of the same neural responses as real fire. Your brain wants fire so badly, it'll accept an obvious simulation over nothing at all. But the fire connection goes deeper than just watching flames. It's written into your biology in ways you probably never think about. Consider this. You're the only species on Earth that has to cook its food, not benefits from cooking or prefers to cook. You literally have to cook. If you try to live on a diet of raw foods, even carefully selected nutritious raw foods, you would slowly starve. Your digestive system cannot extract enough calories from raw meat and raw vegetables to support your enormous brain. You've been so thoroughly transformed by cooking that you're now trapped. You're dependent on fire in a way no other creature has ever been. This is unprecedented in evolutionary history. Plenty of species use tools. Some use them quite cleverly. But no species except humans has become biologically dependent on a technology. Your gut is smaller than it should be for an ape your size. Your jaw muscles are weaker. Your teeth are reduced. Your colon is shortened. All because for hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors outsourced the work of digestion to fire. Cooking is pre-digestion, breaking down tough plant fibers and denaturing proteins before they ever enter your mouth. This saved energy, which got redirected to your growing brain. But it also made you permanently dependent. You can't go back. A modern human raised on cooked food who suddenly tried to adopt a raw diet would face malnutrition, dramatic weight loss, reproductive problems. Women on strict raw diets often stop menstruating because their bodies don't have enough energy to support both basic metabolism and reproduction. This is fire dependence written into your flesh. Yet most modern humans have completely lost the skills their ancestors considered essential. Quick, right now, could you start a fire without matches or a lighter? Not with a magnifying glass or a battery, just with natural materials you could gather from the landscape? Probably not. Your great-great-great-grandparents 100 generations back could absolutely do this. They learned as children. It was as fundamental as learning to walk. But you've lost it. There's a whole movement of people trying to reclaim these skills. Primitive technology enthusiasts spending weekends in the woods, practicing bow drill fire-making and hand drill methods, learning to identify the right woods for friction fire, understanding the precise technique needed to generate enough heat to ignite tinder. It's hard, really hard. Even with instruction, it can take hours of practice before you succeed in making your first fire from scratch. And these are people with modern nutrition, medical care, and education. Imagine learning this as a child in the Paleolithic, knowing that your life and your family's lives might depend on this skill someday. Some anthropologists think this is why primitive fire-making became ritualized in so many cultures. It was too important to leave to chance. Firekeepers in ancient societies often had special status, responsibilities, taboos. The knowledge of fire-making was sacred because it literally was the difference between life and death. When fire went out, people died. This happened repeatedly throughout history. Arctic explorers freezing to death when they couldn't relight their stoves. Shipwreck survivors dying of hypothermia on cold shores. Indigenous peoples preserving coals during migrations, carrying fire with them rather than risk trying to remake it in an unfamiliar landscape. The loss of fire was catastrophe. Now you flick a switch and get instant light, turn a dial and get instant heat, press a button and get instant cooking. You've abstracted fire into electricity and gas, made it safe and controllable, and utterly reliable. This is progress, obviously. Nobody wants to go back to the constant fire-tending labor of pre-industrial life. But something has been lost in the translation. When fire becomes invisible, when it's hidden inside wires and pipes instead of burning in the center of your home, you lose the visceral connection to the technology that made you human, and maybe we've replaced it with something else. Think about where people gather in modern homes, not around fires anymore, but around screens, television screens, computer screens, phone screens. Flickering light in the darkness, everyone's attention focused on the glow, gathering together to share information and stories. Sound familiar? The screen has become the modern hearth. Families gather around televisions the way they used to gather around fires. Couples eat dinner illuminated by laptop screens. Teenagers sit together staring at their phones. The technology has changed, but the behavior pattern is identical. Humans gathering around a light source in the darkness to share experiences. We've transferred the ancestral fire-gathering instinct onto new technology. But screens aren't fire. They don't provide warmth. They don't cook food. And critically, they don't trigger the same physiological responses. Remember those studies showing how watching fire reduces blood pressure and heart rate? Screens do the opposite. Screen time before bed disrupts sleep. Extended screen exposure increases anxiety and stress markers. The blue light from screens tells your brain it's daytime, suppressing melatonin and keeping you alert when you should be winding down. Screens have hijacked the social function of fire without providing any of the biological benefits. This creates what evolutionary biologists call a mismatch problem. Your body is designed for a world where gathering around fire in the evening meant safety, food, and approaching sleep time. It used fire's warm light spectrum as a signal to start producing melatonin and preparing for rest. Now you bathe yourself in blue-white screen light until minutes before bed, then wonder why you can't sleep. Your circadian rhythms are confused. Your ancient fire-adapted biology doesn't understand this new world. The same mismatch shows up in food. Your digestive system evolved for cooked food, yes, but it evolved for food cooked over fires, roasted meat, tubers baked in coals, vegetables steamed in earth ovens. This is very different from industrial processed food. Your ancestors cooked food to make it digestible, to kill parasites, to break down toxins. They didn't add corn syrup, artificial flavors, or preservatives. The nutritional problems plaguing modern society, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, these are partly mismatched problems. Your fire-adapted biology encountering foods that would have been incomprehensible to your ancestors. Some people are trying to bridge this gap. The paleo diet movement, whatever its scientific merits, represents an intuitive recognition that modern food might not match our evolved digestive systems. People cooking over wood fires or coal, trying to recreate ancestral food preparation methods. There's probably something to this, even if the specific claims are oversimplified. Your body does recognize certain patterns as correct, certain flavors and textures as proper food, and those patterns were established by hundreds of thousands of years of fire-cooked meals. But here's what's really profound. Of all the technologies humans have invented, fire is the one that most completely defines us. Not language, because other species have complex communication. Not tools, because other species use those too. Not agriculture, because that came very late in human history. Fire. We are the species that tamed fire, that became dependent on it, that was transformed by it into something unprecedented in Earth's history. Every major human achievement traces back to fire. Agriculture needed fire to clear land. Metalworking required fire hot enough to smelt ore. The Industrial Revolution was powered by fire, burning coal to drive steam engines. The modern world runs on combustion, burning fossil fuels in engines and power plants. Even nuclear power is just a sophisticated way to make fire, using atomic reactions to boil water into steam. We've never moved beyond fire. We've just found new things to burn, and we never will move beyond it, because fire is written into what we are, into our small guts and big brains, into our neural pathways that calm down when we see flames, into our social instincts that drive us to gather around light sources in the darkness, into our dependence on cooked food, into our domination of the planet. You are a fire creature. You always have been. You always will be. When you sit around a campfire or stare into a fireplace, you're not being nostalgic. You're not play-acting a primitive life. You're being fully, completely human in a way that's impossible otherwise. You're connecting with the technology that made everything else possible, the spark that changed everything, the flame that still burns at the heart of human existence, whether you see it or not. So here we are. At the end of a journey that began with a single spark somewhere in the African wilderness, maybe 2 million years ago, maybe earlier. We'll probably never know exactly when or where that first human looked at fire and saw not danger, but possibility. What we do know is what happened next. 3 revolutions, each building on the last, each transforming our ancestors in ways they could never have predicted. First came cooking, the simple act of applying controlled heat to food before eating it. This wasn't just a new way to prepare meals. It was biological transformation on a scale rarely seen in evolutionary history. Cooked food delivered more calories with less effort. Our guts shrank, our teeth weakened, our jaws became more gracile. But all that energy, all those calories that no longer needed to go toward maintaining massive digestive systems, they got redirected upward into larger, more complex brains. Cooking didn't just feed our ancestors. It built the hardware that would eventually let us compose symphonies, split atoms, and send robots to Mars. Then came the conquest of night. For hundreds of millions of years, darkness belonged to predators. Mammals huddled in burrows. Primates climbed trees and waited for sunrise. But fire changed that equation. Suddenly, the night became usable time. Hours that had been lost to fear and sleep became available for tool-making, storytelling, planning. We didn't just survive the darkness anymore. We pushed it back, created islands of light and warmth in the hostile void. Our days effectively doubled. More time to work meant more innovation. More time to socialize meant stronger bonds. The 24-hour cycle that had constrained every species before us became flexible, negotiable, conquerable. But the third revolution, that's the one that truly made us human, the social fire. Those circles of light where our ancestors gathered after dark, where they shared food and stories, where children learned from elders and strangers became allies. That's where culture was born. That's where complex language probably emerged, refined through thousands of generations of fireside conversations. That's where we learned to be more than just clever apes. We learned to be storytellers, teachers, collaborators. We learned to pool our knowledge across generations, building on what came before instead of starting over each time. The superbrain didn't emerge from genetics alone. It emerged from this feedback loop. Fire giving us the calories to grow bigger brains letting us use fire more effectively, better fire use creating more social complexity selecting for even greater intelligence. Round and round for hundreds of thousands of years until we became something unprecedented. A species that could imagine things that didn't exist, and then bring them into being. Think about that for a moment. Fire is older than agriculture by nearly 2 million years. It's older than writing by probably 1.9 million years. It might even be older than complex language. Every other technology that defines human civilization, everything we think of as making us modern, all of it came after fire. All of it was made possible because some ancestor, whose name we'll never know, whose face we'll never see, was brave enough or desperate enough or curious enough to reach toward flames instead of running away. We owe that person everything. Every meal you've ever eaten. Every night you've spent warm and safe instead of cold and terrified. Every conversation you've had after sunset. Every story you've heard. Every idea you've shared. All of it traces back to that moment when fire stopped being something that happened to us and became something we controlled. And here's the beautiful part. We're still doing it. Right now, somewhere, someone is cooking dinner over a flame. Somewhere else, people are gathered around a campfire telling stories under the stars. In cities and villages across the planet, humans are participating in the same ritual that our ancestors performed 1 million years ago. The technology has changed. The scale has changed. But the fundamental act, using controlled fire to transform our world, there remains the same. Every time you strike a match, light a stove, or sit by a fire pit, you're connecting to an unbroken chain of human experience stretching back through time to the very beginning of what made us us. You're not just using technology, you're participating in the defining human act, the eternal flame that separates us from every other species that has ever lived. If this story sparks something in you, if it made you see fire differently or understand your own humanity a little better, do me a favor, hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I love hearing from viewers around the world, all of us connected by the same curiosity about our shared past. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. If you really want to support what we do here, you can join our YouTube membership program. It's completely optional, but it helps us keep making content that explores the deep history of human experience. Now go cook something, gather with people you care about, sit by a fire if you can, and remember that when you do, you're doing what humans have always done. You're keeping the eternal flame alive.